Unbroken, Chapter 18. A Body Breathing. A biscuit was tossed into Louis's cell, breaking into bits on the floor. A tiny cup of weak tea was set on the windowsill. Louis gulped the tea and crawled around, picking up crumbs and putting them in his mouth. There was a rustle outside, and a Kwajalein native appeared. He greeted Louis cheerfully, in English, by name. Louis stared at him in confusion. The man said the castaways were the talk of the island. He was an ardent track fan, and when he'd heard Louis's name, he'd come to meet the great runner. As Louis listened, bewildered, the man chattered about sports, indifferent to Louis's plight. When he glanced at his watch and said he had to go, Louis stopped him. What happened to the Marines held there? They're all dead, the man said. All POWs held on Kwajalein were executed. As the man left, the guard looked challengingly at Louis, lifted a flattened hand to his throat, and made a slashing gesture. He pointed to the names on the wall, then to Louis. The second day began. Phil and Louis lay in sweltering silence, expecting to be dragged out and beheaded. Louis developed explosive diarrhea and cramps doubled him over. Flies, lice, and mosquitoes teemed on him. The heat was smothering. Down the hall, rats wallowed in Phil's waste bucket and skittered over his face. Guards stalked past, snarling and drawing the sides of their hands across their necks with cruel smiles. Days passed, each bringing 2 or 3 rice balls tossed to the floor and a few tiny cups of tea. Louis's diarrhea became bloody. He begged for water. The guard brought a cup. Louis, grateful, drew close to the door to drink. The guard threw scalding water in his face. Desperately dehydrated, Louis kept begging. Each time the response was the same, leaving Louis's face blistered. He knew dehydration might kill him, and part of him hoped it would. As he lay in misery, he heard again the singers from the raft. He let their voices wash over him, finding reason to hope. He held the song in his mind, praying intensely. He stared at the Marines' names, wondering who they were and how the end had come. He pulled off his belt, bent the buckle up, and carved his name beside theirs. The guards were in a fixed state of fury at the captives. Nearly every day they flew into rages that usually ended with Phil and Louis being spat upon and bombarded with rocks and lit cigarettes. Every day, at gunpoint, Louis was forced to dance while his guards roared with laughter. They stabbed him with sticks and taunted him as he crawled around picking up bits of rice. Once driven to his breaking point by a guard jabbing him, Louis yanked the stick away. He knew he might be killed for it, but under ceaseless humiliation, something was happening to him. He was losing his will to live. The crash of Green Hornet had left Louis and Phil in the most desperate physical hardship, without food, water, or shelter. But on Kwajalein, the guards deprived them of something deeper: dignity. This self respect and sense of self-worth, the innermost arraignment of the soul, lies at the heart of humanness. To be deprived of it is to be dehumanized, leaving victims in a state of profound wretchedness and loneliness, unable to hang on to hope. Few societies treasured dignity and feared humiliation as did the Japanese, for whom loss of honor could merit suicide. This is probably one of the reasons why Japanese soldiers in World War II debased their prisoners with such zeal, seeking to take from them that which was most painful and destructive to lose. On Kwajalein, Louis and Phil learned a dark truth, known to be doomed in Hitler's death camps. The slaves of the American South, and 100 other generations of betrayed people. Dignity is as essential to human life as water, food, and oxygen. The stubborn retention of it, even in the face of extreme physical hardship, can keep a man alive long past the point when he would have died. The loss of it can carry a man off as surely as thirst, hunger, exposure, and asphyxiation, and with greater cruelty. In places like Kwajalein, degradation could be as lethal as a bullet. Louis had been on Kwajalein for about a week when his cell door was thrown open and guards pulled him out. Terrified, thinking he was about to be beheaded, he was marched into a building. Before him were Japanese officers sitting by a table heaped with food meant to entice him. Louis wasn't going to be executed. He was going to be interrogated. The ranking officer stared coolly at Louis. Which model of B-24 did he crash in? Louis replied, truthfully, that it was a D model. The officer handed him a pencil and paper and told him to draw the plane. On Oahu, Louis had heard that a crashed D model had been captured by the Japanese. Knowing that they already knew the plane in detail, he drew it accurately. His interrogators held up a photo of a D model. They'd been testing his truthfulness. What did he know about the E model? Nothing, he replied. It was a lie. D model Superman had undergone upgrades that effectively made it an E. How did you operate the radar? Louis knew the answer, but replied that as a bombarder, he didn't know. Told to draw the radar system, Louis drew an imaginary system so elaborate it was later written it was resembled a ruptured octopus. The interrogators nodded. They moved on to his bomb site, which was top secret. How did you work it? You twist two knobs, Louis said. The officers knew he was lying and sent him to his cell without giving him any food. Suspecting he'd be brought back, Louis tried to anticipate questions. He thought of things he could tell and those he would keep a secret. He invented lies and practiced telling them. Because he'd been particularly truthful in the first session, he knew his captors would be more likely to trust his answers. One day, a new guard appeared at the door. Louis felt an upswell of dread. You Christian? The guard asked. Louis said yes. The guard smiled. Be Christian. The guard reached into a cell and slipped two pieces of candy into Louis's hand, then gave two pieces to Phil. A friendship was born. The guard's name was Kawamura, and he spoke almost no English. Each day, he walked between the cells, drawing pictures of things and saying the writing their Japanese names. Louis and Phil would write and say the English names. They understood almost nothing Kawamura said, but his gentle smile and goodwill needed no translation. It was life-saving. When Kawamura was off duty, another guard came. He launched himself at Louis, ramming a stick into his face as if trying to put out his eyes. When Kawamura saw Louis's bloody face, he asked who'd done it, then sped away, furious. Later he returned, opened Louis's cell door a crack, and proudly pointed outside. There stood the guard who'd abused Louis, his forehead and mouth heavily bandaged. He never guarded the cell again. One day, Louis and Phil looked up to see angry faces pressed into their cell windows shouting. Rocks flew in. More men came, screaming, spitting on the captives, hurling sticks. Louis balled up in the floor. On and on it went, some 90 men taking turns attacking the captives. At last it ended. Louis lay in pools of spit and jumbled rocks and sticks, bleeding. Kawamura was distraught over what he had been done to his friends. He told them the culprits were a submarine crew stopping over on the island who had learned Americans were being held there. During interrogation, Louis complained about the attack. It's what you should expect, the officers replied. The interrogators asked Louis the numbers of aircraft, ships, and servicemen in Hawaii. Louis said he'd left Hawaii in May. Now it was August. He had no current information. He was sent back to his cell. Some 3 weeks after arriving on Kwajalein, Louis and Phil were suddenly dragged outside. They were taken to the front porch of the interrogation building where men in medical coats awaited them. Japanese gathered to watch. Louis and Phil were ordered to lie down. The doctors pulled out two long hypodermic needle syringes and filled each with a murky solution. Louis and Phil realized they were about to be used for an experiment. The doctor slid the needles into the captive's forearms and pushed the plungers. Within a few seconds, the porch started gyrating around Louis. The doctor pushed more solution in, and the spinning worsened. Louis felt as if pins were being jabbed all over his body. Then he felt lightheaded. His skin burned, itched, and stung. Nearby, Phil endured the same ordeal. The doctors questioned the captives on their symptoms. Phil cried out that he was going to faint. The doctor withdrew the needle. The captives were returned to their cells. Louis's entire body was covered in a rash. For days he was maddened by the itching and burning. When the symptoms subsided, he and Phil were again injected, this time with more solution. Again, they rolled through dizziness and burned with rashes. Then came a third experiment, then a fourth. In the last, a full pint of fluid was pumped into their veins. They were lucky to survive. In their captured territories, the Japanese were using at least 10,000 POWs and civilians, including infants, as test subjects for unimaginable hellish experiments in medicine and biological and chemical warfare. Thousands died. Battered, emaciated, and sick, Louis was brought into interrogation for the final time. The officers pushed a map of Hawaii in front of him and told him to mark the air bases. Louis resisted, but the interrogators learned hard. leaned hard on him. At last, Louis broke. He dropped his head and told them everything, the exact location of the bases, the number of planes. The Japanese were jubilant. They opened a bottle of cola and gave it to Louis, along with a biscuit and a pastry. It was all a lie. The bases, Louis identified, were the fake airfields he'd seen when tooling around Hawaii with Phil. If the Japanese bombed there, the only planes they'd hit would be made of plywood. The captive's usefulness had been exhausted. At headquarters, the decision was made. Louis and Phil would be executed. On August 24th, men gathered before Louis' cell, and once more he was pulled out. Is this it? He thought. Expecting to hear he was doomed, he was astonished to be told something else. He and Phil were being sent by ship to Japan, where they'd be placed in a POW camp. At the last minute, the officers had decided not to kill them. It would be a long time before Louis learned why. On August 26, 1943, 42 days after arriving on Execution Island, Louis and Phil were led from their cells for the last time. Louis looked back, searching for Kawamura. He couldn't find them.